On the evening of May 14, 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was doing what thousands of American teens do every spring, celebrating the end of another college semester. He had just wrapped up his first year at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, Minnesota, studying wind energy, a field he was genuinely passionate about. Friends and family described him as ambitious, responsible, and close to his parents. That night, Brandon attended a small gathering with friends in Lind, a tiny town of less than 500 people. It was meant to be a normal night of fun, laughter, and goodbyes before everyone went their separate ways for the summer. Nothing seemed unusual. Brandon wasn't depressed, angry, or acting strangely. By all accounts, it was an ordinary evening. But what began as a routine drive home would soon become one of Minnesota's most baffling unsolved mysteries. The drive home. Around midnight, Brandon got in his green Chevy Lumina to head home to Marshall, a 30-minute drive. At first, the drive was uneventful. Friends later confirmed he wasn't intoxicated and showed no signs of being impaired. Brandon was familiar with the area and had made the drive before. But somewhere along the way, he became disoriented. Rural Minnesota roads can be deceiving. Endless stretches of gravel, unmarked turnoffs, and fields that look the same for miles. Many locals say that even experienced drivers can get lost late at night. Just after midnight, Brandon's car hit trouble. His Lumina veered off the gravel road and became stuck in a ditch. It wasn't a crash and the car wasn't damaged, but it was stuck enough that he couldn't drive it out. Alone, stranded, and in the pitch-black countryside, Brandon did what most young adults would do. He called his parents for help. The call for help. At 12:30 a.m., Brandon dialed his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, and told them he had driven into a ditch. He reassured them he wasn't hurt, but he needed a ride. Calmly, he described his surroundings: gravel roads, fields, and what looked like lights from a nearby town. He was certain he was just outside Lind. Brian and Annette immediately got in their car and headed toward the spot their son described. They told Brandon to stay put and keep his phone on. But when they arrived in Lind, there was no sign of Brandon, no sign of his car. Frustrated and confused, Brandon insisted he could see the town lights and that he knew where he was. His parents, just as certain, believed they were in the right spot. What neither of them realized at that moment was that Brandon was 25 miles away from where he thought he was. A father and son argument. As the search stretched on into the early morning hours, Brandon grew impatient. He told his parents he would start walking toward the lights he saw in the distance, lights he believed belonged to Lind. Still on the phone with his father, Brandon walked through fields, gravel roads, and grassy terrain. The phone call lasted 47 minutes, filled with directions, reassurances, and the occasional disagreement about landmarks. His father later described the call as calm, though Brandon was clearly frustrated at the mix-up. Then, without warning, the call ended. The last words, at 2:17 a.m., as Brandon was still on the phone with his dad, he suddenly exclaimed, "Oh, SHT, asterisk," and the line went dead. His father tried calling back immediately, but Brandon never answered again. Over the next several hours, Brian and Annette dialed their son's number repeatedly. Sometimes it rang, sometimes it went straight to voicemail, but Brandon never picked up. By morning, panic set in. What began as a minor inconvenience, a car stuck in a ditch, had escalated into something far more chilling. Brandon Swanson was gone. Morning light brought no relief to Brian and Annette Swanson. Their son had vanished into the night, and every unanswered call deepened their dread. Brandon was not the type to simply disappear. He was dependable, close to his family, and had no history of running away. Something was very wrong. Reporting Brandon missing. At sunrise, exhausted and terrified, Brian and Annette drove to the Lind Police Department to file a missing persons report. But what should have been the beginning of an urgent search instead turned into a frustrating delay. Police initially treated Brandon's disappearance as a routine case of a teenager staying out too late. Officers suggested he was probably sleeping it off somewhere or had decided to crash at a friend's house. His parents, though, knew better. Brandon wasn't drunk. He wasn't careless. He He had vanished while still on the phone with his father. It took hours of pleading before law enforcement finally agreed to begin a search, finding the car miles away. By mid-morning, investigators traced Brandon's cell phone to a tower near Porter, Minnesota, a rural area 25 miles away from Lind, where Brandon had insisted he was. The revelation stunned everyone. How had he misjudged his location so badly? Soon after, searchers located his green Chevy Lumina. Just as he described, it was stuck on the edge of a ditch but not damaged. The car was empty, and Brandon was nowhere to be found. Even more disturbing, Porter was not near the lights of Lind at all. The town lights Brandon claimed to see that night were most likely from Taunton, a much smaller community to the northwest. The question remained, why was he so far from where both he and his parents believed he was? Dogs on the trail. Tracking dogs were brought in to follow Brandon's scent from his abandoned car. At first, the trail seemed promising. The dogs followed his path through fields and along gravel roads, leading searchers into the countryside. The trail eventually led to the Yellow Medicine River, a narrow but fast-moving body of water. There, the dogs lost the scent. Some dogs indicated that Brandon had entered the river. Others suggested he continued walking along its edge. This discovery raised the terrifying possibility that Brandon may have drowned. Yet no body was ever recovered, despite extensive water searches with divers and sonar equipment. A search that never ended. For weeks, hundreds of volunteers, law enforcement officers, and K-9 units scoured the area. They searched ditches, fields, rivers, and abandoned buildings. They even used helicopters and boats. But no sign of Brandon was ever found. No clothing, no phone, no personal belongings. His last known words, "OSHT," asterisk, hung over the investigation like a dark cloud. What had startled him in that final moment? Did he trip and fall? Did he encounter someone or something that caused him to react? The family's frustration. As weeks turned into months, the Swanson family grew increasingly frustrated with authorities. They believed more could have been done early on, and they were devastated by the lack of answers. Their pain was compounded by rumors and speculation in the community, with some suggesting Brandon had run away or faked his disappearance. But Brian and Annette never believed those theories. Their son was planning his future, had strong family ties, and had been speaking calmly with his father up until the final moment. Something had happened, something beyond Brandon's control. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson has puzzled investigators, amateur sleuths, and true crime enthusiasts for more than a decade. With no body, no physical evidence, and only a haunting final phone call to go on, theories about what happened that night have swirled endlessly. Each one raises chilling questions, and none provide complete answers. Theory 1. Drowning in the Yellow Medicine River. The most common theory is that Brandon accidentally drowned after entering the Yellow Medicine River. Tracking dogs led searchers to the water's edge, and some indicated he went into the river. It's a plausible explanation. Brandon was walking at night, possibly in the dark without proper lighting, navigating uneven terrain near a fast-moving river. One misstep could have sent him into the water. But here's the problem. Despite extensive searches using divers, sonar, and watercraft, no body was ever found. In most drowning cases, a body eventually surfaces downstream. Yet after weeks and even years of searching, nothing turned up. Could Brandon really have drowned and left behind no trace? Theory 2. Misadventure in the wilderness. Another theory suggests that Brandon may have wandered too far into the fields, became disoriented, and succumbed to the elements. Minnesota nights in May can be cold, and without proper shelter, hypothermia was possible. But again, there's a problem. If Brandon had collapsed in a field, searchers would likely have found him. Hundreds of volunteers and professionals combed the area. A person lying in the open is hard to miss, especially with aerial searches. The absence of any physical evidence makes this theory less convincing. Theory 3. Foul play. Some believe Brandon may have encountered another person in those dark hours, and that meeting turned deadly. His startled final words, "OSHT," Fuel this speculation. Could someone have been waiting on those rural roads? Did Brandon run into a stranger, or even someone he knew? The area was remote, but not completely empty. Farmhouses dotted the landscape, and locals often traveled late at night. Still, investigators found no signs of a struggle, no suspicious tire tracks, and no reports of dangerous individuals in the area at that time. Without evidence, foul play remains a possibility, but a weakly supported one. Theory 4. Voluntary disappearance. A smaller group of theorists suggests that Brandon chose to vanish, perhaps to start over elsewhere. But this theory crumbles under scrutiny. Brandon had no history of mental health issues, no financial troubles, and no reason to run away. He was in constant contact with his parents up until the end, calmly directing them as he walked. Nothing in his behavior that night suggested he was planning a disappearance. Even more importantly, no digital trail was ever found, no new phone activity, no bank withdrawals, no sightings. For a young man with no preparation, vanishing voluntarily would have been nearly impossible. Strange details that don't add up. Several unsettling details continue to haunt this case. The 25-mile mistake. How did Brandon misjudge his location so badly? He knew the area well. Was it just nighttime disorientation or something more? The lights in the distance. Brandon was certain he saw town lights, but from where he was, it's unclear what he saw. Some believe he mistook farmyard lights for a town. The sudden exclamation. His last words remain the most haunting clue. What did Brandon see or experience in that moment? A fall? An animal? Person? We may never know. When a loved one vanishes, the first hours are critical. Evidence is fresh, witnesses may remember details, and the trail is still warm. But in Brandon Swanson's case, those crucial early hours were lost. Not because of negligence from his parents, but because of the system itself. The delay that cost precious time. On the morning of May 14, 2008, when Brian and Annette Swanson reported their son missing, they expected urgency. Instead, they encountered skepticism. Police insisted Brandon was probably fine and would turn up later. Some even suggested he might have been drunk and was just sleeping it off. For parents who knew their son better than anyone, these dismissals were devastating. Every hour that passed without a search felt like another chance slipping away. Brandon was legally an adult at 19, and law enforcement treated his case as if he had the right to simply disappear if he wanted to. But Brian and Annette knew better. This wasn't a runaway situation. Something was wrong. Living the nightmare, days turned into weeks. Volunteers poured in to help search, but the lack of coordination early on meant potential clues may have been lost forever. For the Swanson family, it was a nightmare with no end. They replayed that 47-minute phone call over and over. His calm tone, his confidence about his location, and his sudden final words. Nothing pointed to a runaway. Everything pointed to danger. For Brian and Annette, the pain was compounded by the knowledge that law enforcement hesitation had robbed them of valuable time. Instead of focusing on hope, they were forced to fight against indifference, turning grief into action. The Swansons refused to let Brandon's case fade into another unsolved statistic. Instead, they turned their grief into advocacy. They began working with lawmakers in Minnesota to address the failures in the system that had slowed the search for their son. Their message was simple but powerful. When someone is reported missing, especially under unusual or suspicious circumstances, the search should begin immediately, regardless of the person's age. This mission led to the drafting of Brandon's Law. Brandon's Law, a new standard, signed into law in 2009, just a year after Brandon disappeared. Brandon's Law requires law enforcement agencies in Minnesota to take missing persons reports seriously, immediately investigating all cases where an adult is missing under suspicious or dangerous circumstances. Before this, many departments treated missing adults as low priority, assuming they had simply left on their own. Brandon's case exposed the deadly flaw in that logic. The law also improved coordination between agencies, requiring them to share information and resources right away instead of waiting. For the Swanson family, it was a bittersweet victory. It wouldn't bring Brandon home, but it might save other families from enduring the same agony. A legacy of awareness. Brandon's disappearance also raised national awareness about how easily young adults can fall through the cracks in the system. His case is now often cited in law enforcement training as an example of why time matters most. The Swansons, while still grieving, found a sense of purpose in knowing their son's story had helped change laws and potentially save lives. They became advocates not just for Brandon, but for every missing person who deserved to be found. It has now been more than a decade since Brandon Swanson vanished into the night, and yet his case remains one of Minnesota's and America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Despite thousands of hours of searching, interviews, and theories, Brandon's fate is still unknown, the search that never ends. Over the years, search teams have returned again and again to the fields and rivers around Porter, Minnesota. Each effort is filled with hope that this time, something new will be discovered. Perhaps a piece of clothing, a personal item, or even Brandon's remains. But every search ends the same way, empty-handed. The land has been plowed and replowed, the river levels have risen and fallen, and technology has advanced. Yet still, not a single trace of Brandon has been found. It is as if he stepped into the darkness and simply vanished. A family without answers. For Brian and Annette Swanson, the pain of not knowing is worse than grief itself. Without answers, there can be no closure. They live in a permanent state of limbo, torn between hope and despair. Every Mother's Day, every Father's Day, every anniversary of his disappearance is a cruel reminder of what they lost. And yet, they continue to share Brandon's story, refusing to let his name fade into silence. Why this case still haunts us. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson strikes a deep chord with so many people because it could have happened to anyone. Brandon wasn't living a reckless lifestyle. He wasn't in the wrong crowd. He was an ordinary young man doing something ordinary, driving home after a night out with friends. And in the space of a phone call, he was gone. The unanswered questions make this case unforgettable. What startled him in those final seconds? How could he vanish so completely, leaving no evidence behind? Is he lost somewhere in the Minnesota countryside? Or did something more sinister happen? A legacy beyond the mystery. Even though his disappearance remains unsolved, Brandon's story has changed lives. Through Brandon's law, countless families now have the assurance that their missing loved ones will be taken seriously from the very beginning. That law stands as a testament to Brandon's memory, ensuring his name is tied not only to mystery, but to progress. The enduring impact. Brandon's case continues to inspire amateur sleuths, law enforcement, and true crime followers to keep searching for the truth. Online forums, podcasts, and documentaries revisit his story year after year. People who never met him feel a personal connection, drawn to the eerie details and the heartbreaking uncertainty. For his family, the hope is simple: that someday, someone will uncover the piece of evidence that solves the puzzle. Until then, Brandon remains both missing and remembered, a young man frozen in time at 19 years old. Final reflection: vanished without a trace. The unsolved disappearance of Brandon Swanson is not just a mystery. It's a reminder of how fragile life can be, how quickly normal can turn into nightmare, and how families can transform grief into change. And until answers come, Brandon's voice, echoing through that final phone call, will continue to haunt the night. OSHT**.